Hey everyone, tonight we begin with something a little different. We're sailing into the grimy, salt-soaked world of pirates, but not the romanticized version you've seen in movies. We're talking about the real deal, the kind of life that would make you grateful for your worst Monday morning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing on a wooden deck that hasn't been properly cleaned in months, surrounded by men who haven't bathed since before you were born, breathing air thick with the stench of rotting food, unwashed bodies, and worse. The ship creaks and groans beneath your feet, like it's actively trying to fall apart, which it probably is. Welcome aboard a real pirate ship, where adventure means dysentery and treasure hunting often leads to an early grave. The romanticized image of pirate life that Hollywood has fed us is about as accurate as a compass made of cheese. You know the one. Swashbuckling rogues with perfectly trimmed beards, clean white shirts billowing in the ocean breeze, and ships that look like floating palaces. The reality was far more brutal, disgusting, and short-lived than any movie would dare to portray. Let's start with the ship itself, because if you're going to spend months or even years aboard this floating prison, you'd better know what you're getting into. Most pirate vessels were stolen merchant ships or converted naval vessels, which means they weren't exactly built for comfort. These weren't luxury cruise liners with spacious cabins and fine dining. They were cramped, leaking, rat-infested wooden boxes that somehow managed to stay afloat, despite the ocean's best efforts to sink them. The average pirate ship measured somewhere between 60 and 100 feet in length, which sounds spacious until you realize that 50 to 100 feet in length, 100 men had to live, work, eat, sleep, and perform bodily functions in that same space. Privacy was not just rare, it was completely non-existent. You'd be lucky to have a hammock to call your own, and even then, you'd be swinging inches away from your fellow pirates, listening to their snoring, groaning, and other less pleasant nighttime sounds. The ship's hull was constantly taking on water, not because of dramatic cannon battles, but because wooden ships just leak. It's what they do. The spaces between the planks would shift and separate, especially in rough seas, allowing seawater to seep in continuously. This meant that someone always had to be manning the bilge pumps, working in the lowest, dampest, most miserable part of the ship to keep everyone from drowning in their sleep. Speaking of sleep, forget about comfortable beds or even basic mattresses. Pirates slept in hammocks if they were lucky, or simply curled up on the deck if they weren't. These hammocks weren't the comfortable rope versions you might imagine lounging in during a vacation. They were rough canvas slings that provided minimal comfort and maximum opportunity for back pain. The constant motion of the ship meant you'd be swaying and rocking all night long, assuming the weather was calm enough to actually fall asleep. Now let's talk about the smell, because no honest discussion of pirate ship life can avoid this particular horror. Imagine the worst locker room you've ever encountered. Multiply that by about 50. Add in some rotting fish, stagnant water, human waste, and the sweet aroma of men who consider bathing a dangerous waste of fresh water. That's the baseline smell aboard a pirate ship on a good day. Fresh water was precious beyond measure, reserved for drinking and cooking, which meant that bathing was practically unheard of. Most pirates would go months without a proper wash, relying on the occasional splash of seawater to rinse off the worst of the grime. Seawater, however, doesn't actually clean you. It just redistributes the dirt and leaves you covered in salt, which creates its own special kind of misery when combined with constant chafing from rough clothing. The toilet facilities, if you could call them that, consisted of a few holes cut in the deck near the bow of the ship. These charming installations were called the heads, and using them required balancing precariously over the side of the ship, while hoping that the waves didn't decide to give you an unexpected bath. Privacy screens were non-existent, so every trip to relieve yourself became a public event. The waste would theoretically be washed away by the waves, but in practice, much of it would end up coating the lower parts of the ship, adding another delightful layer to the ship's aromatic profile. Food aboard a pirate ship was an adventure in creative survival rather than anything resembling cuisine. Fresh provisions would be consumed within the first few days of any voyage, leaving the crew to subsist on whatever preserved foods they could find, steal, or afford. Hardtack, a type of hard biscuit that could survive for months without spoiling, became the staple of pirate dining. These biscuits were often so hard that they had to be soaked in water or rum just to become chewable. And they were usually infested with weevils, which were often the only source of protein available. Salt pork and salt beef provided the main protein sources, though calling them meat is generous. These chunks of preserved flesh were so heavily salted that they resembled leather more than food. They had to be soaked in seawater for hours before cooking, just to make them remotely edible. Even then, the texture was somewhere between rubber and wood, and the taste was overwhelmingly salty, with hints of decay. When fresh water ran low, which happened frequently, the crew would have to rely on whatever liquid they could find. This often meant drinking rainwater collected in dirty barrels, stagnant water that had been sitting in casks for weeks, or in desperate situations, their own urine. Beer and rum were actually safer options than water in many cases, since the alcohol killed some of the harmful bacteria that made fresh water so dangerous to drink after long periods of storage. The daily routine aboard a pirate ship was far from the exciting treasure hunts and sword fights that populate adventure novels. Most days were spent maintaining the ship, which was a never-ending battle against the forces of nature and decay. The sails needed constant repair from wind damage. The rigging required frequent adjustment and replacement, and the deck had to be scrubbed regularly to prevent the buildup of slime and rot. Sailors would spend hours tarring the ropes to protect them from saltwater damage, scraping barnacles from the hull when possible, and pumping out the bilge water that constantly accumulated in the lower levels of the ship. These weren't glamorous tasks, but they were essential for keeping the ship functional and preventing it from literally falling apart at sea. The hierarchy aboard a pirate ship was surprisingly democratic compared to naval vessels of the time, but that didn't mean life was easy for anyone. The captain held ultimate authority during battle and navigation, but major decisions were often put to a vote among the crew. This democratic approach sounds progressive until you realize that it often meant arguments, fighting, and occasional mutinies when the crew disagreed with their leadership. Navigation was a constant source of anxiety, since most pirates had limited knowledge of proper seamanship. They relied on stolen charts that might be outdated or inaccurate, basic compass readings, and a lot of guesswork. Getting lost at sea was a very real possibility, and without modern communication methods, a lost ship might never be found again. The constant threat of disease hung over every pirate crew like a storm cloud. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, would cause teeth to fall out, wounds to refuse healing, and eventually death. Dysentery turned the already miserable toilet situation into a nightmare of constant illness and dehydration. Typhus, spread by the rats and lice that infested every corner of the ship, would sweep through crews like wildfire, leaving men delirious with fever in their filthy hammocks. Yellow fever, malaria, and a dozen other tropical diseases waited in every port, ready to claim pirates who thought they'd survived the worst the ocean could throw at them. Medical care was primitive at best and deadly at worst. The ship's surgeon, if they even had one, was more likely to be a barber or butcher than an actual doctor. Their tools were crude, their knowledge limited, and their supplies consisted mainly of rum for anesthesia and a saw for amputations. Many pirates preferred to treat their own wounds rather than risk the surgeon's ministrations, which often did more harm than good. Injuries were commonplace and often permanent. Splinters from cannon fire could blind a man or embed themselves so deeply in flesh that they never came out. Broken bones rarely healed properly without proper medical attention, leaving pirates with permanent limps, crooked arms, or twisted fingers. The romantic image of pirates with peg legs and hook hands wasn't just artistic license. It was the brutal reality of men who'd lost limbs to battle, disease, or simple accidents aboard ship. The psychological toll of pirate life was perhaps even more devastating than the physical hardships. Months at sea, with the same group of increasingly desperate men, created a pressure cooker environment where tempers flared and violence erupted over the smallest disagreements. A perceived slight over food rations could lead to knife fights. Arguments about navigation could split crews apart. The constant stress of survival, combined with the knowledge that capture meant certain death by hanging, created a paranoid, hostile atmosphere that few men could endure for long. Loneliness was a constant companion, even when surrounded by dozens of other men. These weren't necessarily friendships born of mutual respect and shared interests. They were alliances of convenience between desperate individuals who needed each other to survive, but couldn't necessarily trust each other with their lives or their share of any potential treasure. Sleep was fitful and frequently interrupted, not just by the motion of the ship or the snoring of shipmates, but by the need to constantly maintain watch for enemy vessels, naval patrols, or potential prey. Pirates operated in a world where they were simultaneously hunters and hunted, always looking over their shoulders for signs of trouble, while searching the horizon for opportunities. The weather was an unpredictable enemy that could turn deadly without warning. Tropical storms would batter ships for days, sending massive waves crashing over the deck and threatening to tear the vessel apart. During these storms, pirates would lash themselves to whatever solid objects they could find and pray that the ship would hold together long enough to see calm seas again. Many didn't make it through these ordeals, swept overboard by rogue waves or crushed by falling rigging. But even calm weather brought its own miseries. The tropical sun would beat down mercilessly on the wooden deck, turning the ship into a floating oven. Men would suffer from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and painful sunburns that blistered and peeled in the salt air. There was no escape from the sun's rays, no air conditioning to retreat to, just the constant oppressive heat that made every task more difficult and every moment more miserable. The search for fresh water became an obsession that could drive men to desperate measures. When supplies ran low, pirates would risk everything to reach the nearest island or coastal settlement, often walking into obvious traps set by colonial authorities who knew that thirsty pirates were predictable pirates. The alternative, dying slowly of dehydration while surrounded by an ocean of undrinkable salt water, was a fate that haunted every crew member's nightmares. Clothing was another constant source of discomfort. The rough fabrics available to most pirates would chafe and irritate skin that was already raw from salt water and sun exposure. Garments would rot and fall apart in the humid conditions, leaving men to patch together whatever coverings they could find. Shoes were a luxury that few could afford to replace when they wore out, leaving many pirates to go barefoot on decks that could be scalding hot during the day and treacherously slippery when wet. The social dynamics aboard ship were complex and often violent. Respect was earned through toughness and brutality rather than intelligence or leadership skills. New crew members, whether they joined voluntarily or were pressed into service, faced hazing rituals that could be permanently damaging or even deadly. Veterans would test newcomers' resolve through increasingly dangerous pranks and challenges, weeding out those they considered too weak to pull their weight during critical moments. Gambling was one of the few entertainments available during long voyages, but it often led to bitter disputes when men who had nothing left to lose would bet their future shares of treasure, their weapons, or even their lives on the turn of a card or the roll of dice. These games could destroy crew morale and create lasting grudges that would fester in the confined space of the ship. The constant threat of mutiny hung over every captain, no matter how successful or fair they might be. Crews who felt their leader was leading them toward disaster, keeping too large a share of profits, or simply making poor decisions would plot in whispers and shadows. Mutinies were swift and brutal affairs that often ended with former leaders being marooned on deserted islands or thrown overboard to drown. Even successful pirates faced the grim reality that their careers were necessarily short-lived. The life expectancy of the average pirate was measured in months rather than years. Those who weren't killed in battle, executed by authorities, or claimed by disease would often find themselves growing too old and infirm to continue the physical demands of shipboard life. Retirement wasn't really an option for most pirates, who had no savings, no family willing to take them in, and no legitimate skills that would allow them to find honest work. The romantic notion of pirates retiring to tropical islands with chests full of gold was nothing more than fantasy for the vast majority of these desperate men. The few who did manage to accumulate wealth faced the constant paranoia that their former crewmates would murder them for their share, or that colonial authorities would track them down and strip them of everything before fitting them with a noose. The actual process of acquiring treasure was far less glamorous than popular culture suggests. Most pirate attacks weren't dramatic ship-to-ship battles with cannons blazing and cutlasses flashing. They were ambushes against defenseless merchant vessels whose crews would surrender immediately rather than face certain death. The treasure was usually mundane cargo like sugar, tobacco, or textiles, rather than chests overflowing with gold doubloons and precious gems. When pirates did encounter resistance, the violence was swift and horrific. Naval warfare in the age of sail was a brutal affair, where men were torn apart by cannon fire, impaled by flying splinters, or crushed by falling masts. The romanticized sword fights of cinema bore no resemblance to the desperate, clumsy struggles that actually took place on blood-slicked decks. Most pirates were barely competent with their weapons, and battles were won through overwhelming numbers and sheer viciousness rather than skill or honor. The aftermath of successful raids brought its own problems. Dividing loot among the crew was a source of constant tension and frequent violence. Every man would scrutinize the distribution process, looking for signs that they were being cheated out of their fair share. Arguments over the value of different items could escalate into deadly fights, especially when the crew was already on edge from months of hardship and deprivation. Captured prisoners presented another dilemma that reveals the harsh reality of pirate life. Keeping prisoners alive meant feeding them from already limited supplies and guarding them constantly to prevent escape or revolt. Many pirate crews solved this problem in the most direct way possible, though the details of such solutions are too grim for comfortable contemplation. The few prisoners who were kept alive often faced fates that made death seem like a mercy. The ports that welcomed pirate ships were themselves cesspools of vice and violence. Places like Port Royal in Jamaica or Nassau in the Bahamas were lawless settlements where pirates could sell stolen goods, recruit new crew members, and temporarily escape the confines of their floating prisons. But these ports were also breeding grounds for disease, violence, and betrayal. Pirates who survived months at sea might find themselves murdered in a tavern brawl or succumb to tropical diseases within days of reaching land. The women in these ports were often as desperate as the pirates themselves, trapped in lives of poverty and exploitation with few alternatives for survival. The romanticized image of pirate wenches willingly consorting with dashing rogues ignores the brutal reality of women who had no choice but to serve men who were often violent, diseased, and completely without mercy. Shore leave was typically brief and chaotic, as crews would spend their shares of plunder as quickly as possible on rum, gambling, and whatever pleasures they could afford. Most pirates understood that their next voyage might be their last, so they saw little point in saving money for a future that probably wouldn't arrive. This created a vicious cycle where crews would return to sea broke and desperate, forced to take increasingly dangerous risks to survive. The legal system of the time showed no mercy to captured pirates. Admiralty courts would process dozens of cases at a time, with hangings scheduled like regular market days. The authorities understood that pirates were a threat to the entire colonial economy. And they responded with systematic brutality designed to discourage others from choosing the pirate life. Public executions were theatrical events meant to demonstrate the consequences of defying the established order. Pirates who managed to avoid capture faced the gradual deterioration of their bodies and minds under the constant stress of their lifestyle. Malnutrition left them with rotting teeth, brittle bones, and weakened immune systems. The tropical sun would age their skin prematurely, leaving them looking decades older than their actual years. Many developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, becoming paranoid, violent, and unable to function in normal society, even if they wanted to abandon their criminal careers. The ships themselves were constantly deteriorating under the harsh conditions of tropical waters. Shipworms would bore through wooden hulls, creating leaks that required constant attention. The tropical heat would warp and split timbers, while the salt air corroded metal fittings and rigging. Maintaining a seaworthy vessel required skills that most pirates lacked, leading to dangerous situations where crews would find themselves aboard ships that were barely functional. Navigation remained a constant source of anxiety and frequent disaster. Many pirates were former merchant sailors who had learned basic seamanship, but few had the advanced skills needed for accurate navigation across open ocean. They relied on coastal navigation when possible, following familiar shorelines and using landmarks to determine their position. When forced to venture into open water, they often became lost, sometimes for weeks at a time, as they struggled to find their way back to familiar waters. The psychological pressure of command was particularly intense for pirate captains, who had to balance the conflicting demands of maintaining discipline while keeping their crews satisfied enough to prevent mutiny. A captain who was too harsh might find himself overthrown and murdered, while one who was too lenient might lose control of his ship during critical moments. This balancing act required political skills that few pirates possessed, and the average tenure of a pirate captain was measured in months rather than years. Weather patterns in the Caribbean and other pirate-infested waters were unpredictable and often deadly. Hurricane season would trap ships in port for months, creating overcrowding and tension as crews competed for limited resources. When storms did strike ships at sea, the results were often catastrophic. Entire crews would disappear without a trace, their ships found weeks later as empty hulks, drifting with the currents if they were found at all. The constant threat of disease created a climate of fear that permeated every aspect of shipboard life. When illness struck, it would spread rapidly through the confined quarters, leaving crews too weak to operate their vessels effectively. Pirates would avoid ports known to be infected with yellow fever or plague. But this often meant sailing for weeks longer than planned with dwindling supplies and increasingly desperate crews. The reality of pirate economics was far removed from the treasure-hunting adventures of popular imagination. Most pirate crews operated on the edge of financial ruin, with successful raids barely covering the costs of maintaining their ships and feeding their crews. The division of plunder was governed by strict codes that allocated shares based on rank and contribution, but these systems often broke down when crews faced starvation, or when particularly valuable prizes created tensions that threatened to tear the crew apart. Personal hygiene aboard pirate ships was practically non-existent, creating conditions that modern people would find absolutely unbearable. Men would wear the same clothes for months without washing them, until the garments literally rotted off their bodies. The lack of soap combined with the scarcity of fresh water meant that dirt, sweat, and worse would accumulate in layers on their skin. Open wounds would become infected almost immediately in these conditions, leading to amputations or death from sepsis. The confined quarters meant that every crew member's personal habits became everyone else's problem. Men who talked in their sleep, ground their teeth, or suffered from nightmares would keep their shipmates awake through the long tropical nights. Those with digestive problems would make life miserable for everyone within smelling distance, while men suffering from various tropical diseases would moan and cry out in delirium, creating an atmosphere of constant tension and fear. Communication between ships was primitive and unreliable, leaving pirate crews isolated from news of the outside world for months at a time. They might sail into ports that had been fortified against them, or attempt to attack merchant ships that were actually naval vessels in disguise. This isolation also meant that crews had no way of knowing if their families were alive or dead, if wars had started or ended, or if new laws had been passed that affected their operations. The weapons available to most pirates were crude and unreliable by modern standards. Pistols were single-shot, muzzle-loading devices that were as likely to misfire as to function properly, especially in the humid conditions aboard ship. Cutlasses and other bladed weapons would rust and dull quickly in the salt air, requiring constant maintenance that few pirates knew how to perform properly. Many relied on improvised weapons like belaying pins, boat hooks, or simply broken bottles during combat. The ammunition situation was equally precarious, with gunpowder that had to be kept dry in tropical conditions where everything was constantly damp. Black powder would clump together in the humid air, making it unreliable when pirates needed it most. Lead shot was expensive, and often had to be improvised from whatever metal could be melted down, including pewter dishes, belt buckles, or even coins when desperate times called for creative solutions. The social isolation of pirate life created psychological wounds that never properly healed. These men were cut off from normal human relationships, unable to form lasting bonds with women, start families, or maintain connections with the communities they'd left behind. The constant proximity to violent, desperate men meant that even friendships were tinged with suspicion and the knowledge that survival might require betraying those closest to you. Sleep deprivation was a constant companion aboard pirate vessels, where someone always needed to be on watch for approaching ships, changing weather, or signs of trouble from within the crew itself. Men would catch whatever rest they could in brief intervals, often sleeping while still partially dressed, and ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. The quality of sleep was poor, even when time allowed, as hammocks swayed with every motion of the ship, and the sounds of creaking timbers, snoring men, and scurrying rats provided a constant soundtrack of discomfort. The tools and equipment aboard pirate ships were perpetually in poor condition, having been stolen, improvised, or cobbled together from whatever materials could be found or taken from captured vessels. Rope would fray and snap without warning, sails would tear in moderate winds, and essential navigational instruments would break or become unreliable just when they were needed most. Repairs were constant but rarely thorough, as crews lacked both the materials and expertise needed to properly maintain their vessels. So, there you have it. The real life of a pirate wasn't the swashbuckling adventure we see in movies, but a brutal existence of disease, violence, and desperation aboard floating prisons that reeked of human misery. Next time you watch Pirates of the Caribbean, remember the men who actually lived this nightmare. Sweet dreams, and thank you for sailing through this grim chapter of history with me tonight.